Hey, Walter Sorrells back with more tips for the knife maker. Today, a modern tribute to an iconic knife, the Fairbairn-Sykes Commando Knife. I'm really excited about this project. It's one that I've been wanting to do for a long time, and it's meaningful to me in several ways. Now, first, there's the knife itself. It just personifies the modern warrior spirit. It was invented during the development of the British commando units in World War II, which have, in many respects, been the templates for special ops units ever since. Also, this particular blade was commissioned by a friend, Andy Skeen, for another friend of mine, Andy Brunson. Now, Andy Brunson and I go back a long, long way. Andy and I practiced karate together for nearly 2 decades. He was there for my black belt test over 20 years ago, and, we spilled a lot of sweat and a lot of blood together. One last point here. There are 2 ways of looking at a blade like this. You can make a historical replica, warts and all, of the original thing, or you can do what I did here. This is not a replica. Let's call it a tribute. Very significant departures made from the original, some in order to make functional improvements on the original, and some just to compensate for different types of materials that I used on this tribute knife. So the idea here was to capture the spirit of the original, but in a more, sort of updated or ornamental form. The making of this knife can be divided into 2 parts. First comes the forging of the twist pattern Damascus steel that the blade's made from. And second is the actual construction of the knife itself. We're going to jump into the middle of the project in this video and show the making of the knife proper. Then I'll follow this video with a sort of prequel showing the forge welding of the Damascus steel itself. As soon as that video is complete, I'll add a link. I try to do videos showing a really wide range of projects, many of them very simple projects using simple tools. This ain't that. My Fairbairn-Sykes tribute knife requires a lot of complex tools, a fair amount of expertise, and tons of time. We begin with the prepared bar of twist Damascus steel ground into the rough shape of the Fairbairn-Sykes dagger. There's already a good 8 or 10 hours invested in the project. The twist pattern steel is hiding in there, but to the naked eye, it just looks like any old cheap piece of steel ground into a spike. Before grinding the bevels into the blade, I'll shape the tang. This is a pretty complex and in some respects dull process, but if it's not done carefully, you're pretty much sunk. First, a step has to be made on which the brass guard will sit. Then a stick tang will be shaped on which the lathe-turned wooden handle will be seated. Finally, the end will be threaded to accept the pommel, which will screw down and tighten the whole handle assembly together. Most of this work is done on the mill. The trickiest aspect of a job like this is that the blade has to be milled on 4 sides. If this is off by more than 1/1000th of an inch or so, a huge amount of handwork will be required to square everything up. So, I'm actually using a filing guide to seat the blade accurately on my milling vise. This way, each one of those milling operations across the blade will join up together and everything will be pretty neat. Various little steps are now machined into the blade. The original Fairbairn-Sykes just had a skinny round tang which came straight up out of the blade and was much easier to form, but which also allows all the components to slip and rotate if any of the brazed joints failed. My modern version will be more robust, if a lot harder to make. Incidentally, if you're interested in making this blade, I'll post plans on my Patreon page. Support the channel at any level and you'll be able to pick up scale drawings which will include every little nuance of the design spec'd out to the 1/1000th of an inch. Click the link for details. A lot of the knives I make have tons of room for flexibility in design and implementation, but this one's pretty specific. I'll also grind the bevels into the blade. This is a dagger with bevels on both sides of the blade. grinding the bevels on a dagger is considered to be one of the more difficult challenges a knife maker can face. To keep the center line dead straight and the bevels clean and symmetrical requires that every facet of grinding is done precisely the same from side to side. If not, the center line will wobble and the whole thing will look cockeyed. Before going any further, I'll go ahead and heat treat the blade. In the first operation, I'll heat the blade to about 1500 degrees Fahrenheit in my forge and then quench it in oil. After the quench, I test it to make sure that it's hardened and then put it in my heat treating oven for tempering at around 400 degrees. Now I'll do the final shaping of the tang with my belt grinder. Next, it's time to make the handle. I'll begin by turning the Macassar ebony blank on the wood lathe, then moving it to the chuck on my metal lathe and drilling it. We have to drill it on the lathe so as to assure a really concentric hole. Then it's back to the wood lathe using that through hole to index for final shaping. It all has to be done in this order to assure the concentricity of the hole. The original Fairbairn-Sykes handle is formed of a fairly skinny casting, but I'll be turning mine on the lathe from Macassar ebony. As skinny as the original was, I'm concerned that the ebony will split if I maintain the historical dimensions. Most of the dimensions of this knife, blade length, handle length, and so on, are made to match the original, but here we'll depart a little, turning the ebony about 1/8 of an inch thicker than the original. Purists may groan, but not nearly as loudly as I would have if this thing had smashed into matchsticks in the middle of the project. Let's turn to the guard. The guard on the original is a little flimsy, so I'll use 1/4 inch brass stock instead of the thinner stock used on the original. I begin by drilling a hole to admit the 1/8 inch end mill for milling out the slot. Next, I very carefully forget to turn on the camera while I mill the slot. You can see here though how it came out. As you can see, the ends are rounded. Those will not fit with the square corners of the tang, so we'll have to file those so that the round edges disappear and we get square corners that will fit all together. I want to press fit here so the guard won't slide on without firm pressure, so as to make sure that there are no gaps between guard and steel. You don't want to overshoot, so a lot of tri-fitting is required. Once everything's fitted up correctly, I'll trim the rectangular blank to an oval. Next, I'll clean up the oil residue and scale that's formed in the process of the quench and the tempering. I'll also further refine the surface finish and the grind lines. Once the bevels have been ground in, I'll turn to sandpaper, a very tedious part of the process. Again, unless everything's done pretty meticulously here, you can smear that center line or leave evidence of previous grinding operations. The plunge lines alone, where the bevels meet the ricasso, probably take about an hour of tedious sanding using tiny little tools wrapped with progressively finer grits of sandpaper. Did I mention this was tedious? Now, as we've mentioned, this is twist pattern Damascus steel, but looking at it, you'd never know. Only the most careful examination shows any pattern hiding beneath the bright surface of the steel. So now I'll immerse the blade in a dilute solution of ferric chloride, a relatively mild etchant. The Damascus is composed of two distinct types of steel, carefully forged, welded, and manipulated to produce a complex pattern in the steel. The ferric will eat into those two steels at different rates, producing what appears to be contrasting colors in the steel. I'll clean off the excess oxides with metal polish, revealing what will be the finished surface of the steel. The pommel will be threaded onto the tang, so I'll need to thread the final section of the tang with a 1032 threading die. Now it's time to make the pommel. I'll chuck up brass round stock in my lathe, face it, then turn a shaft, aiming for just a couple of thousandths under the diameter of the hole through the center of the handle. Then I'll drill a hole to admit the threaded tang. Once that's drilled, I'll thread the 1032 tap in by hand. You can do this under power using a really slow speed, but the risk of breaking a tap makes it not worth the potential time saved, at least not to me. Now I'll cut the pommel off the bar, then a little shoulder similar to the cap on the original, a little chamfering with the file, and all we need to do is finish polishing with some sandpaper. We're just about there. I test everything out to make sure that the pieces fit correctly, then final assembly. And there we have it. Total time required for the completion of the knife, not sure exactly, but somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 hours. As usual, it took a lot longer than I'd planned for. If you'd like to see how the twist pattern Damascus steel was made that was used for this knife, click the link to see the first stage in the making of this knife. Thanks for watching, guys. If you feel like you got something out of this video, don't forget to subscribe. Also, click on the link to Patreon for a great way to give back to the channel. Plus, check me out on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Links in the description. If you want something sharp and pointy, maybe a gift for yourself or one of the cooler people in your life, check out my Tactics Armory website and pick up one of our tactical or outdoor knives. And finally, if you want to learn to make Hamons or Japanese swords, check out WalterSorrellsBlades.com, where you can find videos about how I make Hamons, as well as forging, mounting, polishing, and fittings for Japanese swords. Thanks, and see you soon.